All right, back with another diorama from Lizard Landscapes. We've got a Hawaii beach diorama here. Very different from the other one that I've got on the channel. This is really a beginner leaning more towards an intermediate level diorama, and primarily based on the fact that you don't have to create a barrier to hold the resin. So this really is just placed in a plastic cup at a certain angle in order to hold in that resin, whereas the more advanced one on the channel, I create several barriers, several different tests in order to contain that resin. But this is super easy to create. I'll also show another smaller one that's even easier than this. So usually I do a sketch of the project. This is super basic, but kind of gives the idea there. You want to make sure you're wearing one of these dust masks and that you are near an open window with adequate ventilation. So I'm going to go ahead and trace around one of these plastic cups using XPS foam, and I'm going to cut this kind of on the inside of that circle so that it's a little bit smaller because we need to fit this into the bottom of the cup. So I'm going to trace around that particular disc and just keep cutting these discs out and making sure that they fit into this plastic cup. So really I could have stopped at 3, but I created 4 and I think 5 of these discs. So cutting one of those larger discs in half, and knowing the design of this, knowing it was going to slope like it does, I'm just going to cut that last disc in half and kind of extend it that way. So I've got all of these. I'm just going to apply a little bit of glue to the center of each of those discs, knowing that I'm going to carve through the exterior, so I don't want to have to pull the hot wire through that dried glue. It's very difficult. And then with the half moon shapes, just applying a little bit of glue to get those fixed on there. And then once that is dry, I'm going to use a hot wire from the hot wire foam factory. Sort of carve. I've got a little line indicating my guess at the time as to how the landscape is going to look. And cutting away pieces, progressively getting this to the point where it's sort of looking like what I had in the sketch, making sure it can still fit in that cup. And continuing to carved away quite a bit more than what I thought. It's got a little bit of a lip there to be able to bounce the color back into the resin, but it's really quite a small piece. And then taking some sandpaper and going over that beach area, wanting to make sure that that is super smooth. And cutting out using a really small piece of XPS foam what will end up being those lava rocks that are on the beach. So it's based off of reference photos of a beach from Hawaii where you've got white sand and black lava rocks. So just trying to create some texture on that, on those rocks. So you can either use like a brush like this, like a wire brush, or just using your fingernail, or obviously using a knife or several other types of tools to get some sort of texture. So I've got mapped out where I want these rocks with those dotted lines, and I'm going to try to place these in an asymmetrical way where I'll end up having more rocks on the left than I do on the right there. And all the while making sure before the glue dries that I'm going to be able to fit this back into the cup. So gluing on a third rock there, and these three rocks kind of fit together nicely. So as you can see, added quite a bit of texture to those rocks, just looking at reference photos of lava rocks. And so also putting some of those into where that'll be actually underneath the water, so in the ocean part, underneath the resin, that'll be covered by resin. So I'm going to cover all of this once that glue dries for the rocks with a thin layer of sealant, because I'm going to try to do a water test. And what that is really just a test so that you're not wasting resin, you're not wasting your time, you're going to make sure that it looks right as far as where the water line is going to be when it hits, in this case, the beach area. So I've got it set up with some weights just to keep it in place, and just using regular water, I'm going to fill this to where I think it should be, and altering the angle of how the cup is sitting until it's reaching where I think the water line should be, hitting up against that beach area. And then taking pictures, obviously this video, making a mental note of where that is, because that'll come into play when I'm doing the paint job. And then after having done the test, you can pour the water back into a measuring device, and this really gives you a good idea or good guess as to how much resin to mix up for the final piece. I'm going to go ahead and start painting, start applying some color, obviously using a sand color of paint, just using cheap, really cheap acrylic paint. And then applying towards where the underneath the water is going to be an aqua color. So this is a process of applying these two colors, but then also using maybe a third brush that is clean but wet, so that you can try to blend the two colors together. So to get that really nice beach look, there's this seamless blend between aqua and sand. So starting back up the top, and you can really do this all day where you go back and forth switching between colors. If you think it doesn't work, just go back to the opposite color, and then as I'm doing here with the aqua, and pushing it upward. So I know where that water line is supposed to be, and I'm just trying to get it to the point where it is blended as seamlessly as possible. So doing a final pass here and trying to blend those two together. So then also applying a darker blue, so more of like a true ocean blue, to where the deeper part of that ocean would be. Also helps you to put in a little bit more color, so it's not just these two colors. So you've got like more of a genuine blue, and then blending, doing this exact same thing where you're taking a clean wet brush and blending that dark blue into the aqua. So as with all projects, I usually have all these gaps, so I had quite a few gaps with those discs, and using some of that same glue it took to glue the pieces together and filling in those gaps. So then once those are dry, they kind of dry like a cloudy white, I'm just going to take the same sand color and go back over that. And then once that acrylic paint has dried, I'm going to apply a good layer of sealant, because I don't want the resin to be curing or drying up against paint. I've never tested that out, but I've always gone with this method and it's always worked. So mixing together the resin, so I've got 1 part one bottle and 2 parts of another bottle. I'll have a materials list in the the description below, but just follow the directions on whatever resin you're using. But with this particular resin, I'm mixing it for about 15 minutes. So as you can see, I've got the same weights system to keep that cup with its little beach sculpture in place. And just pouring that resin in there. And so at this stage, I can move this a little bit forward, a little bit back, move the weights. Maybe you change your mind last minute with where the angle is. So good idea is with this type of project, using a spoon or some sort of tool to make sure that the resin doesn't bunch up. It gets to where it doesn't look natural. So trying to have more of a seamless blend of that, what's supposed to be the water hitting the beach. So using some leftover resin and creating some of those droplets you saw in the thumbnail in the beginning of the video, as if it's like spilling out onto the surface. So there it is right before I'm going to cover that up and leave that covered for about a week. Going to leave the droplets of resin to dry as well. So this is after 7 days of letting it dry. So you can really see how the color of that underpainting, how the resin is picking up that color. You just take a pair of scissors and try to slowly remove this plastic cup. And I wound up having a little bit of a tear on the, right about there. So I decided to approach it from the other angle, from the other side of pulling this cup, just slowly trying to get it, because the resin, if you notice, gets really thin towards that point, and because of that it gets really weak. Anyway, removing the last part of the plastic. And be sure and watch this intermission. All right, time for another intermission. This is where I go completely off topic and try to motivate those who haven't found God yet to start searching. You've got to wonder about a belief system whereby if everybody actually followed it, we would have no more war and our problems in general would be greatly diminished. There's another video that I'll link to in the description where a street preacher touches upon many subjects, one of which is if everyone actually loved their enemies, there would be no more war. Of course, I'm talking about Christianity as the belief system. There would also be no more lying, no more stealing, no more adultery, people loving their neighbor as themselves. Jesus said in Matthew 5:44, "But I say unto you, love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." I mean, it's just no ifs, ands, or buts. If people were actually loving their enemies, there would in fact be no more war. That's just the logical outworking of that ideology. That and what I mentioned earlier, no lying, no theft, no adultery, feels like all that combined, there would be a domino effect of peace and well-being that would be incomprehensible compared to our current global situation. Now, some might be saying, I've seen people who call themselves Christians not carrying out their belief system, as you've mentioned. I would say you can't judge the belief system by people who abuse it or who aren't actually believers to begin with. I cover this in the other beach diorama video message I did. Just because someone calls themselves a Christian doesn't mean they actually are. It's part of the earlier touched upon lying issue. Anyone can lie and say that they're a Christian and it not actually be so. I'm talking about if people were actually carrying out the Christian faith, the world would absolutely be transformed. It couldn't help but be transformed for the better. It's got to make people think out there. Why wouldn't there be a global movement to accept and move towards this idea? Well, I would say that people are deceiving themselves. Their desires for pleasure are so strong and ingrained in their life that they seek out reasons for not believing in Christianity so that they can continue in their lifestyle. Because if they embraced Christianity, they couldn't continue to live as they do now. They would have to, as Scripture says, deny themselves or deny their desires. The concept of a person being their worst enemy, a person fighting against themselves. Don't be that person who has become trapped by their own lifestyle so much so that they can't understand something that could be so plain to see right in front of their face that even when presented with the most obvious truths, like in this message, they still talk themselves out of it. It's a case of someone being their own worst enemy without knowing it. Jeremiah 17:9 says, "The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" You could be trapped by your own desires to continue in your pleasures or to fit in with your circle of friends, and essentially be escorting yourself, so to speak, to a terrible place when you pass away. Jesus spoke more about hell than he did about heaven. Just think about it. No more lying. Just that alone could prevent a multitude of problems. The point of these videos is really to motivate you to do your own research and to ultimately realize that this topic is worthy of your time. Check out all of the amazing testimonies online of people who have been to heaven and hell and whose lives have been transformed from following Jesus Christ. Thanks for listening. All right, back with, we've got the droplets of resin looking like droplets of water. I'm going to cut out some of the ones that looked good or believable as water. I'm going to spray those down with water and let those soak, because I'm trying to get it to the point where the wax paper will be removable without too much residue. You have to soak them for quite a bit. Sometimes you just can't get that wax paper off of there, but so pulling that off of the wax paper, removing some of that extra paper residue. So as with the other beach diorama I did a prototype. So this is a really good idea, and maybe this is just what you want to do for the project anyway, because it's so much easier. It's just resin in the bottom of an upright cup that's got a little bit of a landscape in there. So a good idea to be able to practice on a project you don't necessarily care about as much or isn't going to be as time consuming to recreate, especially with something you haven't done before. So practicing the ripples on this prototype before moving on to the main sculpture. So you can see there with the reflection how those ripples are looking. Decided to put a second layer on that. And then practicing creating that sort of whitewater foam that you see as the water laps up against the beach, just looking at reference photos. So using a pen with acrylic paint, and then using a watered down glue, putting that just on the beach area, and then sprinkling sand on that. So moving on to the main project, going to start using some of that. It's basically a high gloss glue that you can create those ripples with, putting on that first layer of ripples. So trying to have sort of an arc to the shape of all of those ripples. So, and then covering that thinner part of the resin, in effect, fixed that tear that I had. So back to the prototype, gonna brush off the loose sand. So only applying sealant where you want the sand to go. And so now applying a second layer of that high gloss glue. So 2 layers I've noticed with all the projects I've done in the past just works better in creating a more realistic series of ripples. So I've got some twine. You ended up using some brown twine and some green twine, putting some of that smaller cutout fibers into like a little drop of glue. And this will later become like our beach weeds. So propping up the main project, applying a watered down glue, so propping it up so that none of that glue falls back into where the water is supposed to be, because I'm going to sprinkle some sand on there. Don't want it getting into the water, so it's only going to hit and stick where I've applied that glue. And then once that is dry, brushing that, some of those loose particles of sand out of the way. So I've got some dried beach weeds here. I'm going to go ahead and try to cut off the excess glue. And digging a hole into the prototype and then filling that with just a little bit of glue and putting in some of those beach weeds. Also applying a little bit of glue and then a pebble here and there. So using just a pen with acrylic paint, I'm going to start using a very, very light gray and then later move on to a pure white in creating these foamy highlights here. So I've created quite a few highlights, sometimes just creating little dots, looking at reference photos, trying to create as realistic as possible that sort of white water you get. So here's what I'm talking about on the lower middle. You've got a super light gray, and then towards the top you've got pure white. So it's really good to start with a super light gray, and then as you progress and you want to be able to highlight these highlights, I'm going to use now pure white on just like the very edge of some of those ripples, just to make them pop. And applying watered down glue to the rest of the project, whereby there's not supposed to be water there, and sprinkling sand on all of that just kind of completes the look to have the rest of it have that sand on there. So propping that up, because of its being cylindrical, it's a little difficult to get the sand on there, so you got to prop that up and then apply glue strategically so it does not get on that water section. And then, of course, sprinkling sand on that, continuing on around with propping it up. And as I mentioned, it is modeled after reference photos of a Hawaii beach scene. So I'm going to have all of these rocks in black lava rock. So I'm going to cover all of these. And using a pen with some white acrylic, I'm going to map out where some of these ripples would be kind of meandering through those rocks. Then using a sort of medium gray, I'm going to try to highlight some of these lava rocks. So if you look at pictures, reference photos, just with the way the sun can hit these lava rocks, they end up having a glare or a highlight. Looks like sort of a light to medium gray. And it just brings out the texture of those rocks. Otherwise, it just kind of looks like these black blobs on the beach surface there. And then applying a watered down glue to the tops of those lava rocks, and applying green ground cover. So you could just dry brush those green, but happen to have some ground cover. I made that myself, but you can just buy ground cover at any model railroad shop. And applying some of that green growth as if it's like moss or something growing on the lava rocks. And using some green twine to create some different looking beach weeds. Doing the same thing, putting them in a drop of glue and letting that sit. So covering, actually, I guess accentuating the waves, those two little waves there, trying to have their texture protrude upward. As if that wave has like reached a little bit of a height. So using some of that same high gloss glue to do that. So digging into the main project, digging some holes and then applying some glue into those holes and applying some of those beach weeds. Also applying some glue here and there and gluing on some actual pebbles just to kind of flesh out that look. And going back in with a pen with some white acrylic paint, trying to add to the splatters and splashes and general white water of how that water would be interacting with those lava rocks, and then covering it with a thin layer of that high gloss glue. So all of the parts where the white acrylic paint had been applied need to have a gloss look. So every part that's supposed to be wet, I'm trying to apply this high gloss glue. So even in between some of those rocks. So there you have it, Hawaii beach diorama. Really for the beginner, leaning more towards the intermediate. So be sure and check out the other beach diorama. It's a much more advanced project. And of course, check out all the other projects on the channel. And as always, thank you for watching.